February 13th, 2024. Well, I'm going to focus today on the recent interview that Tucker Carlson had with President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, um, which this has come under a lot of criticism in the mainstream press quarters, of course, including people such as Hillary Clinton and the like. But I thought it was an interesting interview, and of course, in a way, Tucker, I guess, it is an interesting environment when you're interviewing somebody like Putin in the Kremlin. When you are in his lair, so you have to be a little careful what you do there. Maybe I don't know. I guess, but anyhow, but I thought it was a reasonably good interview as such. I mean, it's not one of those kind of hard hitting, put them on the spot interviews, and I don't know. Putin went into this interesting half-hour historical discussion when asked, why he went into Ukraine in 2022, and instead of giving a more, let's say, analytical, strategic type, military type discussion, he got into the history of the region and a little bit more, I guess, who has claim to what lands and so forth. And in fact, a lot of what was in this was not really anything I hadn't fundamentally heard before. In fact, I think anybody that's been following my videos on where I discuss these subjects is probably not something you haven't heard. Um, part of the issue, of course, is the historical geography. We've got this idea that there were a lot of territorial changes that were made at various times, including even up through the end of World War II. Pieces of Germany were carved off and given to Poland, and pieces of Poland were carved off and given to Ukraine. But Ukraine at the time was just a republic in the Soviet Union, and so it's sort of like a state in the United States, I guess, from a practical point of view. And so essentially it was given to the Soviet Union. And the borders, and in fact, including Crimea and all, were just set by the Soviet Union, which is now defunct. And of course, the question is, what is the legitimacy of those borders? You could argue it different ways, of course. But, I think, so that leads to a lot of those issues about Crimea and so forth. And then the rest of the discussion got into a lot of other issues, including, I think basically Putin indicated in there that he was open to negotiations, but he kind of finds the whole idea futile, especially because Ukraine has, as I pointed out before, made it illegal for Ukrainian officials to engage in negotiations with the Russians unless it's toward essentially achieving their war aims, which is basically defeat of all the Russian initiatives in Ukraine, and return of all the territories that were in the Soviet Union's definition of Ukrainian territory. So and I think that he also goes into a great degree of discussion about the fact that when the Soviet Union fell, there was a belief, I guess, among some people in Russia that maybe we could all be friends after that. That essentially, the division that existed during the Cold War could end, and they could become part of the world community effectively, economically, and so forth. And there was even at one time there was a discussion that he raises about Russia applying to become a member of NATO, and of course that was rejected, and so forth. Then discussions also of the defensive missiles that were deployed. I believe it's in Romania. I believe generally designed to be focused against a future and maybe even contemporary at this time Iranian threat. So because Iran has developed some pretty interesting tactical ballistic missiles. And which also pose a big threat to Israel as well, but could to Europe also. So if you like these videos, please give me a like. It helps the algorithm. And of course, we're looking for more subscriptions as always. And of course, you can click the bell for notifications. So yeah, that's kind of it. Now, my attitude is, the whole issue, what should you believe? Well, there's a lot of useful information in it. That doesn't mean you should take everything Putin says at face value. And I would say that it is probably true that the primary reason, because he also gets into the issue of the coup that occurred in 2014, which again I've covered before as well, and that was obviously facilitated by the CIA and U.S. interests, certain NGOs that work on these kind of things, and I think that this led to Russia finally reaching a level that, having tried to negotiate and reason with the West about NATO expansion, I think finally reached a point where it was either fish or cut bait. They had to do something at that point because it's pretty clear cut. And then after that, that's why they secured Crimea, so that they would be able to protect their naval bases there from becoming NATO bases, and then effectively, and that's the way they see it. Whether that we really would have put NATO ships into there or not, I don't know. I mean, remember, the Russians do have a bit of a paranoid viewpoint based on history, which is one reason why there's a lot of focus on history in his discussion. And it will affect the way they act, whether or not it's real or not. I mean, it may be illusory, but it doesn't mean they're not going to act based on it. So the question is, what level of conflict we therefore want to engender, and what do we gain from engendering that level of conflict? And so, at any rate, after the coup, and that's where this whole discussion, which sounds a little bit inane to us, a lot to our ears, about fighting Nazism. What he's referring to is the Ukrainian movements of Stefan Banderas and so forth, who were allied with the Nazis during World War II and also caused some trouble for the Soviet Union after World War II. And I think that's essentially what he's talking about there. And that is a real thing. There was definitely a movement against Russian ethnics in Ukraine after the 14 revolution, and that led to rebellions in Russian ethnic areas, and then ultimately Russia then chose to supply arms and people like the famous Wagner Group people to support their efforts. And then eventually the Minsk Accords were put in place to try to create a ceasefire, which kind of held until the situation that was developing. One other thing that developed, I think, was that the Democrats in the United States, as a weapon against, remember that under Obama, lethal aid was not provided by the United States to Ukraine. Okay. But when Trump got in, the globalist faction then started putting a lot of pressure on Trump because of his kind of off-the-cuff comments, like the one he just made about now I can go on that a little bit too, about the idea that if the NATO countries didn't pay their full 2% to defense they've committed, that he would encourage Russia to attack them. As a little bit of a side, I just saw in the news, though, that all the frontline countries in NATO, including Finland on down to Poland and the Baltic states and Romania, all are putting their 2% in, so that Russia can't effectively do a ground, at least, attack on any of the NATO countries without going through countries that are committed to the level that he said. I'm not sure if he was aware of that or not, but it's an interesting point. At any rate, I consider these comments to be kind of nonsense comments he does all the time. I wouldn't take them too seriously, but a lot of liberals do and then make a big deal about it. The main point he's trying to do is scare them into paying the 2%, I think. At any rate, so let's getting back into Putin and his beef or whatever. So that essentially is what led to this whole thing, and the belief that that Ukraine would become a member of NATO right on their borders. It has led to a situation which they found completely unacceptable. Now, where I do disagree with the Russian line is I believe that they did come to the conclusion that they had a plan that they could implement where they could just sweep in there and take the capital Kyiv quickly, take the areas, land bridge to the areas that were already in rebellion in the east, and maybe go as far as Odessa if possible, and have the regime sort of collapse, and then they could install perhaps a favorable government to take over Ukraine. Well, that idea, of course, didn't work. the Ukrainian defense was fairly good because during the Trump period, I'm getting back to that, the Democrats put a lot of pressure on Trump, which basically led to him starting to provide lethal aid to Ukraine, including advanced tactical anti-tank weapons such as a Javelin, and the British provided the NLAW, which is analogous, well, not exactly as sophisticated, but it's a similar, well, it's a different system, but it has a similar effect, and it attacks tanks from the top. And so the result is that they had a lot of anti-tank capabilities, and the defense was obviously a lot more robust than they expected, and their attack was a lot less well coordinated than they'd hoped, and their plan failed. And so they did enter into a negotiation, and this is all true. They did enter a negotiation to end the war, and effectively they were on the verge of getting a settlement when Boris Johnson showed up, probably in agreement with the Biden administration, to convince them to back out of the negotiations, and they would provide all the weapons they needed to fight the Russians off and drive them completely out, which then led to a massive influx of Western weapons, training of troops, which only led to the Russians being driven out of some of the territories they took. I wouldn't say they were driven out of the areas across the Dnieper River and out of the city of Kherson. There they were driven out. However, the earlier retreat from Kyiv was probably basically based on the fact that the offensive had failed. I don't think that was so much driven out as they just decided it was a futile effort and it'd be better to pull their forces back, cut their losses, and deploy them to the Eastern Front, which is what they did. And the Eastern Front had already had a substantial defense line built, so hence the Russian offensive in that area was not very effective. So I guess that's kind of where we were. Then, of course, we had the big arms buildup that went into 2023, and then the offensive launched in June, which only failed to significantly dislodge the Russians, except from a small salient around Robotina. But other than that, and a few other small advances, but it was kind of an ineffective offensive that had high casualties on the Ukrainians. And now the situation's spun around, and after that, the Russians have now built up their forces, and they're on the offensive, closing on a variety of places, in particular Avdiivka, which they seem to be making major advances. However, Zelensky's fired Zaluzhny as the chief of the army, and Syrsky, who was an infantry commander and the battlefield commander at Bakhmut, is now their new chief of the army, and they're putting in a new team. And the word is they're going to try to counterattack and prevent the Russians from taking Avdiivka. So we'll see how that all works out. But that's kind of the way things are developing at the moment. At the moment, it looks like the Russian offensive is going forward, but these things vary day by day. Okay, so that's kind of it. But I think, getting back to the interview, is essentially Putin laid out his thing. Where I disagree with him was that they didn't plan on being able to topple the government in Kyiv. I think they did. When it failed, they went to a negotiation strategy, but we've blocked that. So bottom line is that probably his position is that if we quit supplying weapons, they're willing to negotiate after a few weeks. I guess after they take whatever it is they want to take. Whether or not that's a precondition for negotiations and other questions, since nobody's offering negotiations. Who knows what they would do if we changed the policy and Ukraine dropped their demand for essentially unconditional capitulation. They might find that the Russians would be open to negotiation. I think all this will have to wait to after the election, which is going to be held on March the 15th, I think, and over the weekend. I guess it's like a 2 or 3 day affair. The Ides of March. Putin is willing to risk that. Well, Caesar, at any rate, we'll see how that goes. So far, it's looking likely that Putin will win re-election. And of course, that will secure him a term, and that may change Russian actions. Because up to that time, I don't think they want to have any major reversals or any major high casualty disasters. And of course, maybe that's why Syrsky's launched an offensive to try to cause that to occur in the next 5 weeks. But so anyway, but that kind of outlines where we are at the moment. I suspect the Russians are open to negotiation, particularly, I think, after the election. Of course, after the election, if things continue along the lines of arms supplies and all these drones that Ukraine is threatening to build to start attacking civilian targets throughout Russia, the Russians may intensify the actions they're taking as well. I mean, I think I think there's a real risk if you put enough pressure on Russia that this thing could escalate in some nasty ways, and such as nuclear, particularly nuclear strikes against Ukraine. Could happen if Russia really is facing a defeat. Right now, they're winning, so at this point, I don't think they see any need to take those kind of geopolitical risks that would be involved in that. What would happen if we really started hurting Russia really bad might be a different issue. And that's why I think it's a bad idea to pursue this and instead of negotiate some kind of a settlement to see what kind of deal they would be open to at this point. Anyway, that's kind of I think what came out of the Tucker Carlson interview, plus my own assessment of the ongoing conflict. That kind of meshed them together and put what I agree with and disagree with in the whole thing. But at any rate, the idea that that Ukraine is a splendid democracy and Russia is this horrible dictatorship is kind of a wrong issue. I think both of them are kind of well, I'll use a term from the Lisa Haven stuff. I like the term. They're both restricted republics. Certainly in Russia, it's restricted who gets to run for president, and sort of like it is in Iran. And right now, elections are completely suspended in Ukraine, and all political opposition is being suppressed. So neither one actually have a high liberty standard at the moment. But the key thing is Ukraine is suffering greatly, and I think the continuation of this war is not a good idea. And that's been my position. I think we can negotiate a deal which would keep Ukraine intact fundamentally. They'll have to lose a few things like Crimea and probably recognize some independence of the areas that Russia now holds. But I don't think, beyond that, I don't think Russia wants to try to take over the whole thing because the insurgency they'd face would just be unmanageable and lengthy. And this whole nonsense we keep hearing in the West about that they're going to take over Ukraine, which they can't, I don't think, and then go on and attack NATO countries. No, they're not going to. They don't want a war with NATO because that would unleash a level of air power that they're simply not facing. A few F-16s of 80s vintage is one thing. The kind of air power NATO would be able to bring out today with our modern fifth generation airplanes is something else, as well as a lot of other missiles that are much more in abundance in the NATO world than that they've faced so far with a few storm shadows. So anyway, that's kind of the way I see the situation and why I think this current thing, and like my previous videos about the idea of holding that funding hostage to having our own border security is a good idea. But it's pretty clear cut that the Republicans in the Senate, the weak Republicans that passed some of the bills, the infrastructure package from year ago, that thing, those people, they're all set to pass a clean bill giving the administration what they want. However, they're going to run into, I think, a big roadblock in the House because I don't think the Speaker can put that up for a vote without basically losing his job. And if the speakership is declared vacant, then they won't even be able to pass the budget. It'd be a complete fiasco. So I think the thing is going to be stalled for some time. I'm hoping they go with the idea that I would recommend of attaching border security measures, preferably the whole H.R. 2, but if not that, at least significant elements of it in order to secure passage in the House, hopefully, and then see what the Senate decides to do. But at any rate, that's kind of my rundown on the situation. And of course, I'll be posting this not only here on YouTube, but also posting it on Rumble. And of course, the addresses of my social media accounts are in the description below. All for now.